Back in the hard winter of 1874, out in the Wyoming Territory, a good woman's value was often tallied up in gold dust, but you could get a child's life for less than a half-empty bottle of whiskey. So when that gavel came down in the smoky, airless back room of the Blackwater trading post, Sarah Miller didn't make a sound. She didn't beg. She just held her baby brother so tight, her knuckles went bone white, and she watched the filthy money slide across the table. She was ready for a monster to drag them away. She was ready for pure cruelty. What she wasn't ready for was the mountain of a man with a scarred face who bought them, looked right at the shivering child and said, "Best put your coat on, son. You're both my family now." This is the gut-wrenching, true-to-life story of how one of the ugliest deals ever made became a love story for the ages. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
The air in the Gilded Spur Saloon was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, unwashed men, and pure desperation. It was late October in the Dakota foothills, and that wind howling outside was promising a blizzard that would bury anyone not strong enough to stand against it. It was hot as a cook stove inside, but all Sarah Miller could feel was a deep-down cold that shook her to her soul. She stood tucked in a corner, her back pressed hard against the rough-cut pine wall, trying to shield the little bundle she held in her arms. Liam, just 6 months old, was finally asleep. His tiny, pale face was nestled against the worn-out wool of Sarah's only coat. At the main table sat her stepfather, Elias Vane. Now Elias was a small, twitchy man, with eyes that never settled, and a soul that had been rotted through by cheap liquor. He was holding a poker hand he swore was a winner, but the sweat shining on his lip told a whole different tale. Across from him sat Cyrus Reed, a cattle baron known all the way from Deadwood to Cheyenne, for just two things: his mountains of money and his complete lack of a heart. "You're all out of chips, Vane," Cyrus rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together in a dry creek bed. He leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs into a silk vest that looked mighty out of place with all the sawdust and spittoons. "And you're all out of credit. Heard the bank took your farm this morning. You ain't got nothing." I got prospects," Elias stammered, his eyes flitting around the room, searching for a friendly face that just wasn't there. "You have nothing," Cyrus said again, slow and easy, as he slid a big Colt revolver right onto the middle of the table. "Unless you're fixin' to pay your debt with blood." You could have heard a pin drop in that saloon. The piano player, a young fella named Jericho, froze right in the middle of a tune. Even the bartender, a big old brute they called Big Jim, stopped polishing a glass just to watch. Elias's panicked eyes shot across the room until they landed square on Sarah. Sarah felt all the air leave her lungs. She knew that look. It was the same one he gave her mama's jewelry right before he sold it. It was the look of a man taking inventory. "No," Sarah whispered, but the word got stuck in her throat. "I got the girl," Elias blurted out, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's strong, 19 years old, can read and write. Cooks better than anyone in this whole territory. And she's untouched." A low murmur went through the crowd. Men turned to look, their eyes hungry and sizing her up. Sarah pulled the blanket up higher over Liam, trying to just fade into the wall. Cyrus Reed turned his head real slow, and his cold, lizard-like eyes made her feel stripped bare. "And the brat, her brother," Elias added real quick. "Throw him in, too, a package deal. Just clear my debt, Cyrus. $500. "She ain't worth 500, a voice yelled from the back. "I'll give you 50 and a mule." The room filled with ugly laughter. It was a marketplace now, a slave market, plain and simple. happening right under the nose of the town sheriff, J.D. Hewitt, who was currently asleep and drooling at the bar. Cyrus looked over at Sarah, a mean little smile playing on his lips. I could use a housekeeper out at the ranch, someone to look after the boys. 300 for the girl and the crying baggage. Done, Elias yelled, and you could see the relief wash all over his pathetic face. Done! Just take 'em. Cyrus stood up, his chair scraping loud on the floor. He started walking towards Sarah, his boots stomping heavy on the wooden planks. He reached out a hand, his fingers thick with gold rings, aiming to grab her arm. Don't you touch me, Sarah hissed, trying to back away. You're my property now, girl, Cyrus sneered. Thud. A huge, gloved hand came down hard on Sarah's shoulder, stopping her cold. But it wasn't Cyrus's hand. Sarah looked up, and then up some more. Standing right behind her was a man she hadn't even seen come in. He was big as a mountain, wearing a coat made of bear fur that still smelled like the wilderness. His beard was dark and full, with melting snowflakes caught in it, and a mean-looking scar ran from his temple clean down to his jaw. He smelled different, too, like pine sap, gun oil, and the cold night air. The whole room went dead silent. This was Silas Mercer. Everybody knew the name, but not many had ever seen him up close. He lived way up high in the Bitterroot Mountains, a trapper and a tracker who only came to town a couple of times a year. The rumor was he'd killed a grizzly bear with just a knife. Another rumor said he'd lost his mind a long time ago. Silas didn't even look at Sarah. His eyes were locked on Cyrus Reed. Step away, Silas said. His voice was quieter than Cyrus's, but it had a kind of power to it that seemed to make the floorboards hum. This is a private matter, Mercer, Cyrus spat, though he did take a little step back. I just bought 'em. You bought a debt, Silas corrected him. He walked right past Sarah, moving smooth as a panther toward the table. He reached inside his big coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the table. The sound it made, a heavy, solid thud, told everyone it was full of gold, not just dust. 700, Silas said. Gold, not credit. Elias Vane's eyes looked like they were going to pop right out of his head. $700 was a king's ransom. It was enough to start over somewhere new, or to drink himself into an early grave in style. Sold! Elias hollered before Cyrus could even say a word. To Mr. Mercer! Cyrus's face turned a dark shade of purple. Now you hold on a minute. I had a deal. Silas just turned his head, his hand resting easy on the handle of a massive Bowie knife on his hip. The auction's over, Reed, unless you want to bid in lead. Cyrus looked at the pouch of gold, then at the size of Silas Mercer, and finally at all the men in the room watching him. He spat on the floor. Fine, take her. She's too scrawny for winter anyway. Both of them will likely freeze to death before you even reach the timberline. Silas didn't bother to answer. He walked back over to Sarah. Up close, his eyes were a surprising clear gray, like the sky right before a snowstorm. He looked at the trembling young woman, and then his gaze dropped to the bundle where Liam had started to fuss. Sarah braced herself. She was waiting for him to grab her to tell her what she was supposed to do. But instead, Silas reached out and gently adjusted the blanket around Liam's little head, shielding the baby from the draft coming through the door. Wrap him up tight, Silas said. His voice was rough as bark, but there wasn't any meanness in it. That wind's getting stronger. We're leaving now. Leaving? Sarah whispered. Where? Home, Silas said. Before the pass closes up. He turned and walked right out into the snow, just expecting her to follow. And since she had no other choice in the whole world, Sarah Miller stepped out of that saloon and into a life she couldn't even imagine. The town of Blackwater Creek was swallowed up by the white curtain of snow within an hour. Silas Mercer didn't have a carriage. He had two enormous horses, some kind of Clydesdale mix, that looked like they could pull a mountain clean out of the ground. He also had a pack mule loaded down with supplies. He lifted Sarah up onto one of the horses, a mare he called Bess, and then he fixed Liam into a special leather sling he rigged up on Sarah's chest. "Just hold on to the pommel," he told her, checking the cinch. "Bess knows the trail. Don't fight her." For the first 4 hours, not a single word was spoken between them. The only sound was the crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow and the lonesome whistle of the wind through the tall fir trees. They climbed up from the muddy lowlands into the clean, deadly white of the high country. Sarah's mind was churning. Who in the world was this man? $700 was a crazy amount of money. Men didn't pay that kind of fortune for a housekeeper. They paid that for a prize stallion or for a wife. The thought made her feel sick to her stomach. Elias had sold her, pure and simple. She belonged to this man now. She watched him riding up ahead. He sat straight and tall in the saddle, his head always moving, watching the tree line. He had a Winchester rifle in a scabbard right by his knee, and he looked like he was as much a part of this wild country as the granite rocks sticking up out of the snow. As the sun started to sink, painting long purple shadows on the snow, the temperature dropped like a stone. Sarah started shaking something fierce. Her coat, a hand-me-down from her ma, was worn clean through. Silas stopped the horses. He swung down from his saddle and walked back to her. Without saying a word, he unfastened his heavy bear fur coat. "I'm fine," Sarah chattered, her pride fighting a losing battle with the cold. "You're freezing," Silas said, like it was the simplest fact in the world. "And if you freeze, the boy freezes." He draped the giant coat over her. It was heavy, must have weighed 20 pounds, and it wrapped her in immediate warmth. It smelled like him, like wood smoke and pine. Underneath it, he just had on a thick wool shirt and a buckskin vest. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice all muffled by the fur collar. "Why'd you buy us?" Silas looked at her, and his gray eyes were impossible to read. He fiddled with the stirrup on her saddle. "Elias Vane is a pig. He would have sold you to a cat house in Deadwood as soon as Reed's money ran out." "So you saved me?" Sarah asked, and a little spark of hope lit up inside her. "I needed someone," Silas said, his voice flat. "And I don't trust the women in town. They talk too much." He got back on his horse and nudged it forward. That little spark of hope in Sarah's chest flickered and died. So that was it. He did want a servant, or maybe something worse. They made camp that night in a little cave, sheltered from the wind. Silas built a fire like he'd done it 1,000 times, and the flames danced up, lighting the rock walls. He cooked up some salt pork and beans in a skillet and handed her a tin plate. To Sarah. "Eat," he told her. "You are going to need the fat." Sarah was starving, so she ate. She mixed up some hardtack and water into a mash for Liam, rocking the boy until he fell sound asleep. When she finally looked up, Silas was cleaning his rifle, and the firelight was just dancing off the steel barrel. "You got a name?" he asked, his eyes still on his work. "Sarah," she answered, "and this here is Liam." "Liam," Silas said the name as if he were feeling its weight. "That is a strong name. Irish." "My father was," Sarah said. "He died down in the mines 3 years back." "The mines have a way of taking good men," Silas said quietly. He snapped the rifle back together with a sharp click. "You best get some sleep, Sarah. We have to cross the Devil's Backbone tomorrow, if we are not over it. By noon, a big storm is going to catch us right out in the open." "Where are we headed?" Sarah had to ask. "Grizzly Peak." Silas pointed his chin toward the tallest, darkest shape, cutting a line against the night sky full of stars. "My cabin is up on the North Ridge." "But that is miles up," Sarah whispered, her heart sinking. "Nobody lives that high up." "I do," Silas said. He unrolled a bedroll for himself on the far side of the fire. "Sleep." He turned his back completely to her. But there was no sleep for Sarah. She watched him, her hand wrapped tight around a small, sharp rock she had found earlier. She promised herself if he even looked her way, she would use it. But Silas Mercer never stirred. He slept like a log. Still, Sarah had a powerful feeling that if a little twig snapped a mile off, he would be on his feet with that rifle in his hand before the sound even died out. Getting across the Devil's Backbone was a pure nightmare of wind and ice. The path was hardly 2 feet wide, with a straight drop of 1,000 feet on one side. Sarah just squeezed her eyes shut, trusting the horse to know where to step. Liam started crying from the change in the air, a tiny little wail that the howling wind just snatched away. Silas. He was like a machine. He led the horses himself, kicking his own boot heels into the ice to make steps for them. He did not slip once. He never even hesitated. He was like a force of nature, just taking on that mountain and winning the fight. By the time they finally made it to the flat top, Sarah was tired clear through to her bones. But that is when she saw it. It was not the little shack she had been picturing. It was a fortress made of timber and stone. The cabin was huge, built from logs as big as tree trunks with white clay packed in the cracks. A stone chimney was puffing gray smoke straight up. There was a barn, a smokehouse, and even a corral. The whole place was tucked into a bowl-shaped valley, with tall cliffs all around it like a little sanctuary in that frozen wasteland. "We are here!" Silas hollered over the wind. They rode straight into the barn, and the feeling of being out of that wind nearly made Sarah fall over. Silas came and helped her down from the horse. Her legs just gave out, numb from the cold and the long ride. He caught her without any trouble, his hands big and steady around her waist. For just a heartbeat, they were standing there close. Sarah looked right up into his face. That scar was a jagged, ugly thing. But his eyes, they were surprisingly soft. He set her back on her own 2 feet and took a step back right away. "Go on inside," he said, pointing to the cabin. "The door is not locked. The fire ought to still be going. I will see to the animals." Sarah stumbled her way toward the cabin. She pushed the heavy oak door open and just gasped. It was warm. The floor was covered with braided rugs. There were bookshelves, real bookshelves, and they were full of books with leather covers. A rocking chair was sitting right there by the hearth. Everything was clean and tidy, and the whole place smelled like cedar wood. She walked over to the fire, stirred up the glowing embers, and put another log on. The heat felt wonderful. She unwrapped little Liam, who blinked his big blue eyes and made a happy sound. "We are all right, Liam," she whispered, and she kissed his forehead. "We are going to be all right." The door opened again and Silas came in, stomping the snow off his boots. He was carrying 2 big saddlebags, which he dropped on the table. "There is water in the barrel over there," he said. "Well, flour and sugar are in the pantry, and there is dried meat down in the cellar." He took off his thick coat and hung it on a wooden peg. He looked over at Sarah, who was still standing by the fire, her hand clutching that rock inside her pocket. "You can let go of the rock now, Sarah," Silas said in a low voice. Sarah went completely still. "What?" "The rock in your pocket," Silas said, pouring some water into a basin to wash up. "I saw you pick it up last night. I heard you holding on to it the whole ride up." Slowly, Sarah pulled her empty hand out of her pocket. "You did not say a word about it." "Well, I figure a woman in your spot has every right to be scared," Silas said, drying his face on a rough towel. He turned to look her square in the eye. "So, let us get things straight from the get-go. I bought you because I live up here by myself, and this winter is fixing to be the worst one in 10 years. I need help. I need somebody to cure hides, cook the food, and make sure the fire stays lit while I am out running my trap lines." He took 1 step closer, and his face was dead serious. "I did not buy a wife. I did not buy a plaything. I bought a partner to work. You will sleep up in the loft. I will sleep down here. You pull your weight, and you and the boy will have plenty to eat. If you try to run off, the wolves will find you long before you ever reach the tree line. Do we have us an understanding?" Sarah looked right at him. She saw the hard set of his jaw, but she also saw that he was telling the plain truth. He was not like Elias. He was not like Cyrus Reed. He was something else altogether. "We have an understanding," Sarah said, and her voice did not shake one bit. "Good," Silas nodded. He walked to one of the bookshelves and took down a small wooden box. He tossed it to her. Sarah caught it. It was heavy. She lifted the lid. Inside were 20 gold coins. "That is your pay for the first 6 months," Silas said. "Paid up front. If you decide to stick around till spring, you can take it and leave if that is what you want." Sarah just stared at the gold. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. "Why?" "Because you are not a slave, Sarah," Silas said, already turning back toward the door. "I am going out to check the perimeter. Supper will be at sundown." He walked out, leaving Sarah standing there by the fire with all that gold in her hand, and a strange kind of warmth starting to grow in her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. For the first couple of weeks, they settled into a routine. It was a life filled with hard work. Sarah scrubbed and cooked and mended clothes. Silas would be gone before the sun came up and would not be back until after dark, usually dragging a deer or a string of rabbits with him. They hardly ever talked, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable anymore. It felt peaceful. Sarah started to see little things. She saw how Silas would sit by the fire at night and carve little wooden animals for Liam. She noticed he would always take the piece of bread that was a little burnt, so she could have the good one. But that piece was a fragile thing. One evening, about the middle of November, Sarah was sweeping the floor near the big trunk, at the foot of Silas's bed. The lid was open just a crack. Curiosity, a dangerous and sharp feeling, got the better of her. She gave it a little nudge with her broom. Inside, right on top of some old wool blankets, was one of those old-timey photographs in a silver frame. It was a picture of a younger Silas before the scar, and he was smiling. Sitting next to him was a beautiful woman with laughing eyes, and she was holding a baby boy in her lap. Sarah picked it up, and her heart just ached. He had a family. "Put it back." The voice was a low, angry growl. Sarah jumped, almost dropping the frame. Silas was standing right there in the doorway with snow melting on his shoulders. His face looked like a thundercloud. I was just sweeping," Sarah stammered. "It was already open." Silas crossed the room in 2 long steps. He snatched the picture out of her hand, his movements rough and angry. For a second, Sarah was sure he was going to hit her. She flinched away from him. Silas saw her flinch. He just froze, and all the anger in his eyes seemed to break apart, replaced by a deep, terrible pain. He looked down at the photo, then over at Sarah, then at Liam playing on the rug. "Her name was Mary," Silas whispered, and his voice cracked. "And the boy's name was Thomas. They died 4 years ago. Smallpox." "I am so sorry," Sarah said, her voice soft. "I had no idea." "That is why I live all the way up here," Silas said, placing the photograph gently back in the trunk and locking it up tight. "The sickness cannot make it up this high. Most people cannot either." He turned back to her, and his eyes looked haunted. "But trouble has a way of finding its way uphill. I saw some tracks today. Shod horses. 3 of them." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Who was it?" "I am not sure," Silas said. He walked to the window and looked out into the darkness that was closing in. "But they were scouting, looking for a way up the backbone." He turned around and his hand was resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Somebody is coming for you, Sarah, and I do not reckon they are coming to buy anything." The snow fell even harder that night, like a white curtain that cut them off from the whole world. But the warmth inside that cabin was gone. Silas paced back and forth on the floorboards, and his heavy boots made a tense, steady beat. He cleaned his Winchester rifle for the 3rd time, checking it over and over. Then he would go to the window and just stare out into the black nothing. Sarah sat by the fire, with Liam sleeping in the cradle Silas had carved for him. The box of gold coins felt like a lead weight in her pocket, a token of a freedom she might not have. But the fear she had heard in Silas's voice had tied her to this mountain stronger than any debt ever could. "Who would come all this way?" Sarah asked, just to break the silence. "Elias sold us. The debt was paid." "Cyrus Reed," Silas said. "He would not come all this way for a housekeeper he never wanted in the first place." Silas stopped his pacing. He turned and looked at her, the firelight catching the silver hairs in his beard. "Men like Reed, they do not take losing well. But this is not about Cyrus Reed. Those tracks, they were made by cavalry horses, or by men who used to ride for the cavalry." Sarah frowned. "The army? Why on earth would the army care about us?" Silas walked to the table and poured himself a cup of coffee that was as black and thick as tar. "I do not know, but I am sure as heck fixin' to find out." The answer came 2 days later, not with a gunshot, but with a stranger collapsing right at the edge of the woods. Silas had been outside chopping wood when he saw the figure stumble out from behind the snowdrifts and fall flat on his face. He did not go running. He stood and watched for a whole minute, his rifle up, checking for an ambush. When he saw nothing, he finally moved. He dragged the man into the barn. It was Jericho, the piano player from the Gilded Spur Saloon. The young man was about frozen solid. His fingers were blue, and his lips were all cracked and bleeding. Sarah ran in with blankets and a bowl of hot broth. "Jericho, how did you find us?" Jericho coughed, and his whole body shook with shivers. He grabbed Sarah's arm with a strength she would not have thought he had. You have to run." "Why?" Silas asked, his voice hard as iron. "Who is on our trail?" Not Reed," Jericho wheezed. "Pinkertons. Detectives from back east, from Chicago." Sarah couldn't make heads or tails of it. Pinkertons. Here for me, she thought. I ain't never been east of the Mississippi River. Jericho just shook his head, his gaze drifting over to the little bundle Sarah had set by the door. "Not for you, Sarah," he said quietly. "They're here for the baby." The silence that fell over that barn felt heavier than a foot of snow on the roof. "Spill it," Silas demanded, taking a step forward. "Elias, he got to drinking," Jericho whispered. "After you were gone, he started running his mouth about the boy, about where he really came from. He didn't find Liam in some orphanage, Sarah, and he sure ain't your brother." The whole world started to tilt sideways. Sarah had to grab the door of a horse stall just to keep her feet. "What in the world are you talking about, my mother?" "She's the one who brought him home. She told me he was a late-in-life blessing." "Your mother was a fine woman," Jericho said, with tears starting to well up in his eyes. But she was plain terrified of Elias. About 6 months back, Elias stumbled upon a woman, a real wealthy lady, dying in a carriage wreck on the old post road. Her driver was already gone. She was just holding that baby tight. She gave Elias a locket and begged him to take the boy to his daddy in Boston. And then she passed on. Jericho took a long, shaky breath. Elias. He took that locket, sold it for cash, and took the baby. He told your mama the boy was just a stray he'd found. But that locket, well, the fellow who bought it recognized the family crest on it. It belongs to the Harrington family, big-time railroad men. They've been searching high and low for the heir to their fortune. Sarah stared down at Liam, sleeping like he didn't have a care in the world. He's an heir? He's worth millions of dollars, Jericho said, and the man who's coming for him, a hired gun by the name of Kincaid, he works for the uncle, the one who gets every last penny if that baby ain't ever found. Silas let out a soft curse. If the uncle only gets the money if the baby's gone, then Kincaid ain't coming here to rescue him. He's coming to kill him. Jericho nodded, his voice barely a whisper. He's got 5 men with him, and they're all hard cases. They were down at the trading post, asking about a mountain man with a scar. Silas stood up taller. his face turning into a stone-cold mask of pure fury. He looked straight at Sarah, the paid housekeeper, the servant girl. That piece of property he'd bought was gone. In her place was a woman scared to death for a child she loved like her very own. "He's my brother," Sarah said, her voice fierce as she pulled Liam in close. "I don't give a damn about the money. He's mine. He's ours," Silas corrected her. He turned to the wall where his old trapping gear was hanging. He grabbed a heavy double-barreled shotgun and a bandolier full of shells. "Jericho, can you still shoot?" Silas asked. "My hands." Jericho looked down at his frostbitten fingers. "I don't reckon I'll be playing the piano anytime soon, but I can still pull a trigger." "Good," Silas said. "Sarah, you take the boy down to the cellar, bar the door, and don't you dare open it unless you hear my voice. My voice exactly." "What are you fixin' to do?" Sarah asked, clutching Liam tight. Silas walked over to the big barn doors and shoved them open. The storm had finally passed. The sun was going down, painting the snow on the ground in shades of blood red. "I'm fixin' to introduce Mr. Kincaid to this mountain," Silas said, "and this mountain don't take kindly to trespassers." Kincaid showed up about 3 hours after the sun went down. He was a professional, all right. He didn't just ride up the main trail. He sent 2 of his men to circle around the back ridge trying to find a high spot to shoot down into the cabin. He kept 3 men with him, coming up slow from the tree line, using the dark shadows for cover. But Silas Mercer knew every rock, every tree, and every change in the wind on Grizzly Peak. He had already prepared the ground. The first scream sliced through the cold night air like a sharp knife. It came from up on the ridge. One of the flankers had walked right into a bear trap Silas had buried deep in a snowdrift. The heavy iron teeth snapped shut on the man's leg, crushing the bone. "Stay down," Silas hissed. He was laid out on the roof of the cabin, wrapped up in a white sheet that made him invisible against the snow. He held his Winchester rifle steady. Down below, in the dark woods, a muzzle flashed. A bullet smacked into the logs of the cabin. Silas fired back in an instant. He didn't shoot at the flash. He shot at where the man was likely to move right after taking his shot. A shadow in the trees crumpled to the ground. "That's one," Silas counted to himself. "Mercer!" A voice boomed out from the darkness. It sounded smooth and educated, but it was dripping with pure menace. "Kincaid. There's no need for any of this. Just hand over the child. You can even keep the girl. We'll leave you a share of the gold. Come and get him," Silas yelled right back. Another round of gunfire exploded. Bullets busted out the windows. Down in the cellar, Sarah huddled in the pitch black, her hands clamped over Liam's ears, just praying. She could hear the heavy stomping of boots on the porch and the sound of glass shattering. Jericho was posted at the kitchen window, firing an old rusty revolver blindly out into the night. "They're getting closer, Silas." "I know," Silas muttered under his breath. He slid down the back of the roof, landing soft and quiet in the deep snow. He moved like a ghost, circling around his own cabin. He found the second man from the ridge trying to pry open the back door. The fella never even heard him coming. Silas hit him hard with the butt of his rifle. The man dropped like a sack of potatoes, but Kincaid was a smart one. He'd used the noise as a distraction to rush the front porch. The front door blew open with a loud crash. Silas sprinted. He dove right through the broken kitchen window just as Kincaid and another one of his gunmen stepped into the main room. "Clear the room," Kincaid shouted. Jericho popped his head up from behind an overturned table and fired. His shot went wild, but it was enough to make Kincaid duck for cover. Kincaid shot back and his bullet caught Jericho right in the shoulder. The old man spun around and fell, letting out a groan. "Jericho!" Sarah screamed from underneath the floorboards. "Shut up!" Kincaid roared, pointing his pistol down at the floor. "Come on out, girl, or I'm going to start burning this whole place to the ground." Silas rose up from the shadows of the kitchen. He didn't have a clean shot at Kincaid without taking a chance on hitting the trap door where Sarah and Liam were hiding. He dropped his rifle and pulled out his big Bowie knife. The sound of the steel sliding out of its leather sheath was a metallic whisper that Kincaid heard loud and clear. Kincaid spun right around. "Mercer, you are one tough man to kill." "You're on my land," Silas said, his voice low and rumbling with rage, "and you threaten my family." Kincaid just laughed. "Family? A woman you bought and a stolen bastard child. My family," Silas roared, and he charged forward. The gunman with Kincaid raised his rifle, but Silas was just too quick. He grabbed the barrel, twisted it away, and drove his knee hard into the man's stomach, sending him flying back into the fireplace. Kincaid fired his pistol. The bullet grazed Silas's ribs, feeling like a line of fire across his side. But Silas didn't stop. He tackled Kincaid, slamming him clean into the heavy oak table. The table splintered into pieces. They rolled around on the floor, a mess of angry limbs and pure fury. Kincaid was younger, and he was faster. He managed to get his forearm pressed up against Silas's throat, pinning him down. "It's all over, old man. That money is mine." Silas's vision started to get spotty. He couldn't get a breath. The weight of all his years, the bitter cold, the new wound, it was all catching up to him at once. "This is it," he thought. "I failed them." Bang! The sound was deafening inside that little room. Kincaid's eyes shot wide open. He went limp and slumped forward, his grip going slack. Silas shoved the body off of him and took a huge gasp of air. He looked up. Sarah was standing at the top of the cellar stairs. She was holding the heavy Colt revolver that Silas had left on the table earlier. Her hands were shaking something awful, but her eyes were wide open. She had climbed out the second she heard Silas struggling. She had made a choice to fight. "Sarah," Silas wheezed, pushing himself up. She dropped the gun and ran straight to him, falling down on her knees. "You're bleeding! Oh, my God, you're bleeding!" "I'm all right," Silas grunted, checking the wound. "It's just a scratch. Is the boy safe?" "He's asleep," Sarah sobbed, pressing her forehead right against his chest. He slept right through the whole thing. Silas wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. The rush of the fight was wearing off, leaving him tired right down to his bones. But he felt something else, too, a fierce, burning pride. "You did real good, Sarah," he whispered. "You did real good." The silence settled back over the mountain. The wind howled outside, but the sound of gunfire was finally gone. Silas slowly got to his feet, pulling Sarah up with him. He went to check on Jericho, who was pale but awake. "You'll live, kid," Silas said, tossing a roll of bandages at him. "But you ain't never playing piano in a saloon again." "Didn't much like the tips anyway," Jericho grimaced. Silas walked over to the door and looked out at the mess. The snow was already starting to cover the bodies. It was over, but he knew, with a heavy feeling in his gut, that it wasn't really over. Men like Kincaid don't just work for themselves. The Harrington family was powerful. If that uncle wanted the child dead, he was just going to send more men. A whole army the next time. He closed the door and slid the heavy bar across it. He turned back to Sarah, who was holding Liam again, rocking him gently by the fire. "We can't stay here," Silas said, his voice heavy. "Not anymore. They know where we are." Sarah looked up at him, the fear coming right back into her eyes. "Where can we go? The pass is blocked by the snow." Silas walked to his old trunk, the one that held the picture of his wife who had passed. He opened it up again. He lifted up the false bottom, showing a stack of maps and property deeds. "I ain't just been trapping all these years, Sarah," Silas said. "I've been planning. I've got a claim. A whole valley way up north in the Yukon Territory. There ain't no law up there, no Pinkertons. It would be just us and the wild country." He walked over to her and cupped her face in his big, rough hands. "I made you a promise to keep you safe," he said, "and I aim to keep that promise. But it means we have to leave everything behind. This cabin, this life, all of it." Sarah looked at the strong walls of the cabin, the only place she had ever felt truly safe in years. Then she looked down at Liam, and finally she looked up at the long scar on Silas's face, and into those gray eyes that looked at her with a kind of tenderness that just melted her heart. "Home isn't this cabin, Silas," she said softly. "Home is wherever you are." Silas closed his eyes for just a second, and when he opened them again, the ghost of his dead wife was finally gone. Pack the mules, Silas said. We're leaving at dawn. The journey down from Grizzly Peak was like a funeral march for the life they were leaving behind. They were leaving behind. They slipped away under the cover of a blinding snow squall, and the horses had to step high through the deep drifts. Silas rode out front, his eyes fixed on the white nothingness ahead. Sarah was on Bess, holding on to little Liam so hard her arms began to ache. Jericho, pale and wincing with every bump from his horse, brought up the rear. They pushed on for weeks and didn't stop till they reached the flatlands of Montana. The land had changed from the tight-packed pines of the mountains to the wide-open, fearsome emptiness of the plains. They split up at a little no-name trading post near the Missouri River. Silas sat, Jericho down at a rough-hewn table in a dark corner of the place. He pushed a heavy pouch full of gold across the table to the boy. "This here will get you to California," Silas said, his voice low. "The weather's warm and the doctors are good. You can't make this trip north, son. That cold will get in that shoulder and finish you." Jericho just looked at the gold for a second, then slid about half of it back. "I only need enough for a train ticket. You keep the rest for the baby." He looked over at Sarah and tried to give her one of his charming smiles, but it turned into a grimace. "You know, if anybody asks, I'll tell them Silas Mercer and that girl died in an avalanche back in the Bighorns. I saw it with my own 2 eyes." Sarah gave him a hug, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Thank you, Jericho." "Go on now," Jericho whispered, "before this snow clears up." Watching Jericho ride west was the first time Sarah felt the true burden of their new life. They were like ghosts now. The journey north from there was a hard, cruel test of their will to survive. They finally crossed the border into the Canadian territories late in January. The cold up there was like a living creature, a hungry predator just waiting for one little mistake. Silas began to change. The mountain man in him got harder, more dialed in. He started sleeping in, 10-minute spells. He hunted with a kind of desperation Sarah had never seen in him. But he was different with her. The old lines between boss and servant had all melted away in the snow. One night, while they were huddled in a lean-to near the frozen banks of Great Slave Lake, the temperature plunged to 40 below zero. The fire was sputtering out. Silas moved his bedroll right next to hers. "We gotta share body heat," he said, his voice all gravel. "If we don't, we won't be waking up." Sarah didn't put up a fight. She just curled into him with her back pressed against his chest. He draped the heavy bear coat over both of them. She could feel the slow, steady thump of his heart. "Silas," she whispered out into the darkness. "Yeah? Are we just chasing a ghost?" she asked him. "Does this valley of yours really even exist?" Silas stayed quiet for a long while, and his arm tightened just a bit around her waist. "It exists. I found it 10 years ago. It's a thermal pocket. There are hot springs. The ground never truly freezes solid. It's a place where things can heal." "You never went back," Sarah pointed out. "I never had a reason to," Silas mumbled, and his breath warmed the hair on her neck. "I do now." The change between them wasn't some sudden fire. It was more like a slow, steady thaw. It happened when Silas showed her how to shoot the Winchester, his hands gently guiding hers. It happened when Sarah mended a tear in his shirt while he still had it on, her fingers brushing against the old scar on his chest. By the time they made it to the Yukon Territory, the spring melt was on. The rivers had turned into roaring floods of ice and mud. The last thing in their way was the Liard River. It was swollen up and angry, and it was blocking the path to their hidden valley. "We gotta swim the horses across," Silas yelled over the roar of the water. "There ain't no other crossing for 50 miles. Things went south about halfway through. A huge log, hidden by the frothing water, slammed right into Silas's horse. The poor animal screamed and went under. Silas was tossed into the freezing current. "Silas!" Sarah screamed. She saw his head pop up once, just long enough to gasp for air before the river pulled him back under. Without a second thought, Sarah kicked Bess forward. The mare fought hard against the current, pushing downstream. Sarah didn't have a rope. All she had was a long willow branch she'd torn from the bank. She leaned way out of the saddle, the icy water soaking through her skirts. "Freezing her legs solid! Grab it!" she hollered. Silas's hand shot out of the water, clawing at the air. He caught the branch. Sarah held on with every bit of strength she had. Her muscles screamed as the river tried to yank her clean out of the saddle. Bess finally found her footing on a gravel bar and pulled them ashore. They collapsed on the far bank, shivering and coughing up river water. Silas just lay on his back, staring up at the gray sky. Sarah crawled right over to him and started pounding on his chest. "Breathe. Damn you, Silas Mercer, breathe." He coughed, then rolled over and looked right at her. His lips were turning blue, but his eyes were alive. You cussed?" he rasped out, a weak smile touching his lips. "I'll do a whole lot more than that if you die on me," Sarah sobbed, and just collapsed on top of him. Silas's arms wrapped around her, holding her tight. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her then. It was cold and wet and tasted like the river, but it was the most desperate and honest thing Sarah had ever known. Right there, in the middle of the Yukon wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stolen heir, they found something worth more than the whole Harrington fortune. 2 days later, they rode their horses through a narrow crack in the granite cliffs and looked down. Below them lay a valley painted in emerald green. Steam was rising soft and easy from natural pools. Herds of caribou were grazing on the rich grass. It was so beautiful it hardly seemed real. "Home," Silas said. 3 years later, 1878. The cabin in the valley wasn't some kind of fortress. It was a home. It was built from golden cedar and sat near the hot springs with a garden all around it where Sarah grew potatoes and other hearty vegetables. Liam was almost 4 years old now. He was a wild little thing, always running through the tall grass with a wooden sword, chasing the big wolf dog Silas had tamed. He called Silas Pa. He didn't know a thing about railroads or Boston or the price that was on his own head. Sarah stood out on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd filled out now, looking healthy, her skin tanned by the northern sun. She watched Silas chopping wood down by the stream. He moved with a rhythm she knew by heart. They had been safe. It seemed the world had forgotten all about them, or so they had thought. The silence of the valley was broken, not by the sound of a gunshot, but by the cawing of crows. Silas stopped chopping. He stood there stock still, just listening. He walked up to the porch, his face looking mighty grim. "Sarah, go get the rifle." "What is it?" Sarah asked, her heart starting to pound with that same old rhythm from the gilded spur all those years ago. "Horses," Silas said, "a lot of 'em coming through the pass. They weren't ever supposed to be found. Jericho had done his part. The stories of their deaths had been believed, but it turns out hatred is a better tracker than greed will ever be." The riders came out from the crack in the cliffs. There were 10 of them. The man leading them wasn't Concannon. He was long dead. It was a man in a black suit that looked plain ridiculous out here in the wild with a bunch of hardened mercs on either side of him. It was Archibald Harrington, the uncle. He had spent 3 years and a small fortune chasing after ghosts, driven by the fear that the true heir might one day come back to claim the company. They rode right up to the cabin and formed a half circle. Silas stood on the porch holding the Winchester in the crook of his arm. Sarah stood right there beside him with a shotgun in her hands. She pushed Liam behind her legs. "Mr. Mercer," Harrington said, his voice sounding thin and greedy, "you are a very difficult man to find." "Get off my land," Silas said, his voice calm. "Your land?" Harrington let out a dry, crackling laugh. "This territory ain't even on a map. It belongs to no one, just like that boy belongs to no one." He pointed a gloved finger straight at Liam. "I don't want to fight, Mercer. I just want to tie up a loose end. You give me the boy. You and the woman can keep this little paradise of yours." Silas looked at the 10 men. They were armed to the teeth with repeaters and long-range rifles. It was a firing squad. "You know I can't do that," Silas said. "Then you die." Harrington shrugged. "Kill them." The mercenaries all raised their rifles. "Now!" Silas roared. He didn't shoot at the men. He shot at the ground, right at a pile of dry brush he'd set up 50 yards to the left, which was hiding a blasting cap from his old mining supplies. Boom! The explosion wasn't meant to kill nobody. It was meant to scare the hell out of them. The horses, spooked by that sudden thunder, reared up and bucked. The whole formation just fell apart. "Run!" Silas yelled to Sarah. But they didn't run away. They ran straight into the steam from the hot springs. The springs created a natural bank of fog close to the eastern cliffs. Silas and Sarah grabbed Liam and disappeared into the white mist. "After them!" Harrington screamed, fighting to control his horse. "Flush them out of there!" The mercenaries jumped off their horses and charged right into the steam. It turned into a massacre, but not the kind Harrington was expecting. That steam was Silas's world. It blinded the attackers, it muffled their hearing, and it split them all up. Silas moved through it like a ghost. He didn't use the rifle. The fighting was too close for that. He used his knife. He used the land itself. A mercenary would see a shadow, fire his gun, and find nothing was there. Then Silas would come up from behind. Sarah wasn't just sitting around either. She hid Liam in a little cave vent they had prepared for just this kind of nightmare. Then she circled back, flanking the men who were busy hunting her husband. She saw one of them aiming a pistol right at Silas's back. She didn't think twice. She fired the shotgun. The kickback bruised her shoulder, something awful, but the man went down. One by one, the mercenaries fell to the ghosts in that mist. Finally, quiet fell over the steam fields again. The only sound left was the bubbling of the water. Silas walked out of the fog, blood dripping from his knife, his chest heaving. He found Sarah near the cave. She was safe. "Where is Harrington?" Silas asked. They walked back toward the cabin together. The mist began to clear. Archibald Harrington was sitting on his horse all alone. His men were either dead or had run off. He was holding a pistol, but his hand was shaking so bad he couldn't get a steady aim. Silas walked toward him. He didn't even raise his weapon. He walked right up to the horse, reached up with his bare hands, and pulled Harrington clean out of the saddle. The rich tycoon hit the mud with a wet smack. Harrington scrabbled backward on the ground, plumb terrified of the mountain of a man standing over him. "Please," Harrington whined. "I can give you twice the money. Whatever you want." Silas stared down at the man with nothing but contempt. "You came 3,000 miles just to hurt a boy. All the gold in the world could not buy you out of this." Silas lifted the blade high. "Silas, stop!" The sound of Sarah's voice sliced through his anger. He stopped cold. Turning his head, he saw Sarah approaching with Liam holding her hand. "Do not do it," she said, her voice steady. "Not in front of our boy." Silas glanced over at Liam. The child was just standing there, his eyes big as saucers. Silas pulled in a long, slow breath. The fury that had consumed him began to fade. He brought the knife down. He snatched Harrington up by his fancy collar. "You are leaving here," Silas said in a low voice. "You will walk back over that mountain pass with no horse, no rifle, and no grub." "That is a death sentence," Harrington wailed. "The wolves, the freezing cold." "It is a chance," Silas told him. "A better one than you offered that boy." He pushed Harrington hard toward the rocky path. "Get walking. And if our paths ever cross again, my wife will not be here to talk me out of it." Archibald Harrington, the man they called the Railroad King, shuffled off into that enormous, cruel Yukon country. No one ever laid eyes on him again. 6 months down the road, a preacher, lost while heading to the Klondike, happened upon their valley. He discovered a little cabin overflowing with warmth, good food, and happy sounds. They invited him to stay for supper. Later that night, with only the firelight to see by, he held a small service. They had no witnesses but the tall mountains and the bright stars. Silas Mercer held Sarah Miller's hand. His own calloused and scarred hand shook just a little as he placed a plain ring, one he had fashioned himself out of a gold nugget, on her finger. "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked. "I do," Silas answered, his eyes fixed on Sarah like she was the sun and the moon. "And do you take this man?" Sarah gazed at the man who had purchased her freedom, the man who took on all comers for her sake, the man who had become her whole world. "I do," she said softly. They never went back to the settled world. After a while, the Harrington fortune was taken by the state since no one claimed it. Liam was raised to be strong and wild, a true mountain man with no idea he had swapped a fancy prison for a whole kingdom of open sky and green forests. And on those nights, when you could hear the wind moaning through the mountains, Silas would draw Sarah near to him by the fireplace, and they would share their tale. Not the part about the selling or the gold or the fighting, but the one about how two people who had been hurt by the world found one another in the middle of a blizzard and created a love strong enough to stand against anything. That is the amazing tale of Silas and Sarah. It goes to show you that family is not always about who you are related to, but about who you would fight for. It proves that even when things are at their worst, when folks treat you like property, you can still find a new beginning and a love that can overcome it all. Silas Mercer was more than just a man of the wilderness. He was a protector who showed everyone that being a father comes from the heart, not from bloodlines. If this story warmed your soul, we would sure appreciate it if you hit that like button. It does a whole lot to help our channel out. Go on and share this video with somebody you know who believes in a love that lasts. And be sure to subscribe and click that little bell so you do not miss another one of our stories from the Old West. We thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.